Hello, everybody. Welcome back after a long break. I needed that break. I was tired. I needed that Thanksgiving break. And of course, I did the Bannon show, War Room, on Thanksgiving, 2-hour show. It was really good. Talked about Abraham Lincoln and Thanksgiving, a whole lot of things. I had to try to convince Steve Bannon that religious toleration came from Oliver Cromwell. He didn't like that one very much, but that's okay. When we left off, we had actually gone a little past this in the book, in Patriot's History of the United States, and that's it back here. Oops, back there, which is the 15th anniversary edition. I have completed the 20th anniversary edition. It will be available in the spring sometime free on the website. It will consist of a PDF with all the new corrections. There's 3. Additions and insertions, there's about 10 or 12, maybe 20, and a full new chapter from 2018 to 2023, which is pretty long. It'll all be free in PDF form, and that'll be available sometime in the spring after Patriot's History of Globalism comes out on February 20th. So you want to reserve that and get ready to get that, but it's going to be a good one. So where we are is I'm reading today from Patriot's History Reader. That's not in any of our special Black Friday offers, by the way. Dragon Slayers is, Patriot's History and Dragon Slayers, and some other books like The Politically Incorrect Guide to the American Presidents or Politically Incorrect Guide to the American Revolution. Those are offered as part of our Black Friday offers. Check those out at the website. These are good deals, but you're going to have to get your orders in fairly soon if you want them by Christmas. Now, if you don't care, I don't care. But if you want it by Christmas, you're going to need to get an order in fairly soon. So anyway, I'm reading from the Patriot's History Reader, and this is chapter 17, page 119, The Address on States' Rights and Nullification by John C. Calhoun, 1832. This is our introduction. The nullification crisis, in which the power of states to nullify federal laws was questioned, pitted against each other, 2 stubborn Scots-Irish pioneers of similar background, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, President and Vice President of the United States. Jackson grew up in the Waxhaws, North Carolina, lost his mother and 2 brothers during the Revolutionary War, and was orphaned at 14. Calhoun lived in Abbeville, South Carolina, lost an uncle to Loyalists during the Revolutionary War, his grandmother to the Cherokees, and was orphaned at 13. The issue at hand was Jackson's Tariff of 1832, which Calhoun championed. Calhoun in South Carolina saw as transferring wealth to northern states by keeping prices high for northern finished goods while leaving raw cotton unprotected. Calhoun championed states' rights and held the position that unconstitutional federal laws could be nullified by states as a means of defending their rights, the Constitution, and the people against an out-of-control federal government. For this position, he drew upon the concept of interposition, in which a state could interpose its laws between the federal government and the citizens, developed by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798-99. Jackson was sympathetic to South Carolina's position, but tended to see the situation as a threat to the Union. At a Jefferson Day dinner, Jackson toasted, "Our federal Union, it must be preserved." Calhoun countered, "To the Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." Calhoun gave the following address to accompany the passage of South Carolina's Ordinance of Nullification on November 24th, 1832. Much of the address has been written 4 years earlier for his tract called South Carolina Exposition and Protest, but had undergone careful revision. In December, Calhoun resigned as vice president to represent his state in the fight and returned to the Senate. Henry Clay brokered a compromise and the situation was defused, but the principles were resurrected again when South Carolina seceded from the Union in 1860. The arguments presented by South Carolina were never subjected to adjudication, i.e. to the Supreme Court, and still attract adherents today. There's still people who think you can interpose state laws between people and the Constitution. States were endowed by the Constitution with certain reserved powers according to the 10th Amendment, but Jackson, like so many presidents since, seemed willing to ignore the constitutional sovereignty of states in favor of more federal power. Historian William H. Freeling has called the crisis, quote, a prelude to civil war, but even today it leads one to question whether states have any rights at all if the federal government is always free to usurp them. From an address to the Convention of the People of South Carolina in November 1832 by John C. Calhoun. We then hold it as unquestionable that on the separation of the crown of Great Britain, the people of several colonies became free and independent states, possessed of the full right of self-government, and that no power can rightfully be exercised over them but by the consent and authority of the respective states, expressed or implied. Now, let me just say this. You've already heard me argue that on several occasions, Jefferson, then later Madison, then, of course, later still Lincoln, argued that it was the people who were the organizing force of the revolution and the Constitution. Okay, the Constitution begins, we the people, not we the states. Jefferson refers to the people of the colonies, not to the colonies. So I don't think Calhoun has a leg to stand on here. I think the record is fairly clear that all of the founders, from Jefferson on one side to Madison on the other, saw the people, not the states or the colonies, as the organizing force behind the Union. We also hold it as totally unquestionable that the Constitution of the United States is a compact between the people of the several states, constituting free, independent, sovereign communities, that the government it created was formed and appointed to execute, according to the provisions of the instrument, the powers therein granted as the joint agent of the several states. Well, he got that part right. It was the people. That in all its acts transcending these powers are simply and of themselves null and void, and that in the case of such infractions, it is the right of the states. No, that's not what you just said. In their sovereign capacity, each acting for itself and its citizens in like manner as they adopted the Constitution, to judge thereof in the last resort, and to adopt such measures not inconsistent with the compact as may be deemed fit to arrest the execution of the act within their respective limits. Such we hold to be the right of the states in reference to the unconstitutional act of government, nor do we deem their duty to exercise it on proper occasions less certain and imperative than the right itself is clear. Now, let's also look at this. How was the Constitution ratified? By the state legislatures? No. By the governors? No. By newly formed constitutional conventions of the people. Notice that? Yes, they came by state. Each state had a convention. But these conventions were not part of the state apparatus. They were specially constructed by the people. Now, of course, they did this because they knew that some states probably wouldn't go along with the Constitution, but that the people would. Anyway, just keep that in mind. These are small distinctions, but they're very important. We hold it to be very imperfect conception of the obligation with each state contracted in ratifying the Constitution, thereby becoming a member of the Union, to suppose that it would be fully and faithfully discharged simply by abstaining on its part from exercising the powers delegated to the government of the Union, or by sustaining it to the due execution of those powers. These are undoubtedly important federal duties, but there is another, not less important, to resist the government should it, under the color of exercising the delegated, encroach on the reserved powers. The duties of the states is no less clear in the one case than in the other, and the obligation is binding in the one as in the other. And in like manner, the solemn obligation of an oath imposed by the states through the Constitution on all public functionaries, federal and state, to support that instrument comprehends the one as well as the other duty, as well as that of maintaining the government in due exercise of its powers, as that of resisting it when it transcends them. Okay, lot of big words, right? What is he saying here? He's saying something many of us would agree with, which is, if the federal government is dramatically transcending its constitutional authority, we not only have the right, but the obligation to stand up and resist. However, in this case, what was being resisted? It was a tax law. Who authored that tax or tariff law? John C. Calhoun. He wrote it knowing it was constitutionally legal. Why? Because it originated in Congress. Now, there's a question of whether or not a tax is different from a tariff, wherein the tax can only originate in the House and a tariff might originate in the Senate. One is a fundraising bill that imposes itself upon the people. That would be a tax. The other is a fundraising piece of legislation that applies to foreign imports. And I think there's probably, I'd have to look it up, I think there's probably constitutional positions on either side of that. But the point is, he wasn't challenging it on the fact that the Senate originated the legislation, because it was he himself who originated the legislation in the Senate. What he was challenging was that the law was constitutional, but he wrote the law. So now he's turning around 180 degrees. Oh, no, this is unconstitutional and we must oppose it. Well, no. Tariff bills, tax bills are all part of the legislative branch's authority. It's perfectly within the legislature's authority to create a tariff or tax bill. Now, had he chosen to argue it that this is created by the Senate, not the House, he might have a chance. That was tried in the Obamacare business. It didn't fly then, because if you remember, Obamacare was really started in the Senate and then passed by both houses. But that's a lesson for later. So I am continuing on page 121. But the obligation of a state to resist encroachments of the government on the reserved powers is not limited simply to the discharge of its federal duties. There is no encroachment by the federal government with a tax or a tariff, especially on imports. That is precisely the bailiwick of the federal government. And Calhoun knew it because he wrote it. We hold that it embraces another, if possible, more sacred than that of protecting its citizens derived from their original sovereign character, viewed in their separate relations. There are none of the duties of a state of higher obligation. Indeed, the primitive duty preceding all others and in nature paramount to them all, and so essential to the existence of a state, that she cannot neglect or abandon it without forfeiting all just claims to the allegiance of her citizens, and with it her sovereignty itself. In entering into the Union, the states by no means exempted themselves from the obligation of this, the first and most sacred of the duties, not indeed can they without sinking into subordinate dependent corporations. It is true that in ratifying the Constitution, they placed a large and important portion of the rights of their citizens under the joint protection of all the states with a view to their more effectual security. Well, that's generous. They did not put it under the joint protection of all the states. They put it under the United States government. And all of those powers reserved to the states are explicitly laid out. All of the powers given to the federal government are explicitly laid out. Anything not given to the federal government is explicitly delineated. What was not given to the states? What was given to the federal government? The power to tax. This is pretty simple, and Calhoun's doing ring around the rosy here, trying to evade the key issue. Let's see. It is true that in ratifying the Constitution, they placed a large important portion of the rights of the citizens under joint protection of all the states with a view to their more effectual security. But it is not less so that they reserved at the same time a portion still larger and not less important to their own immediate guardianship, in relation to which the original obligation to protect the rights of the citizens that whenever quarter assailed remained unchanged and unimpaired. Nor is it less true that the general government created in order to preserve the rights placed under the joint protection of the states, in which, when restricted to its proper spheres calculated to afford them the most perfect security, may become, when not so restricted, the most dangerous enemy to the rights of the citizens, including those reserved under the immediate guardianship of the states respectively, as well as those under joint protection. And thus, the original and inherent obligation of states to protect the citizens is united with that which they must contract to support the Constitution, thereby rendering it the most sacred of all duties to watch out and resist the encroachments of the government, and on faithful performance of which we solemnly believe the duration of the Constitution, liberty, and happiness of the country depend. He still hasn't come to grips with the original issue, that the very thing he is protesting was legitimately, read my lips, legitimately put under the auspices of the legislative body of the federal government, not to the states. The states cannot levy national taxes, nor can they levy import duties. And he still won't deal with that. He's trying to make a general argument that when government exceeds its authority, we have the right to resist. Nobody argues that. But what authority here is the federal government abusing? None. He wrote the law. But while we hold rights and duties of the states to be such as we have stated, we are deeply impressed with conviction that due to the relationship existing between them, the members of the common union, and the respect which they ought ever to entertain towards government ordained to carry into effect the important objects for which Constitution was formed, that the occasion to justify a state in interposing its authority ought to be one of necessity, where other peaceful remedies have been unsuccessfully tried, and where the only alternative is interposition on one side or oppression of its citizens and imminent danger to the Constitution and liberty of the country on the other, and such we should be to present. That the prohibitory or protective system which has been stated is embraced in these acts, which we have declared to be unconstitutional. Okay, back to this. What specifically is unconstitutional there, Johnny? You haven't said. What you're complaining about is a tariff, which the legislature of the U.S. government has full authority under the Constitution to levy. You haven't made a single case here that that's not what's happening. And oppressive in its operation on this and the other staple and exporting states, and dangerous to the Constitution and liberty of the country, and that all other peaceful remedies have been tried without success, and occasion has been occurred where it becomes the right and the duty of the state to interpose its authority to arrest the evil within its limits. We hold to be certain, and it is under this deep and solemn conviction, as we have acted, when we reflect on the principle on which the system rests and from which the government claims the power to control the labor and capital of the country, and the bitter fruits it has already produced, the decay and impoverishment of the entire section of the country, and the widespread discord and corruption, we cannot doubt that there is involved in the issue not only prosperity of this, but of other staple exporting states, but also the constitution and liberty of the country. So now he's starting to say, well, it's unconstitutional because it only affects part of the country. Folks, any tax only affects some of the people or affects people differently. There's no tax system you can possibly conceive that affects all people the same way. Well, we should do a fair tax. A fair tax, you're only taxed on what you buy. Well, that disproportionately disadvantages poor people who by nature have to spend a much higher portion of their income on food, shelter, fuel. Well, we should have a flat tax. That's better than we're taxing everybody the same. Okay, well, again, that somewhat is disproportionate against poorer people. I like it. I think it's better. I think a flat tax is far to be preferred to a fair tax, but it's still not fair. Well, what if we have a regressive tax? Regressive means the more money you make, the less in taxes you pay. Now, think about it from this perspective. If you wanted to incentivize people to go out and earn the next dollar, that is to work overtime so they made a little more money, which would reduce their tax rate, the best tax system we could have would be the one that is regressive. Now, I know that's not going to fly because nobody's going to stand for the rich people making more and more, having fewer and fewer taxes, lower taxes, the more money they get. I get that. But in theory, to incentivize people the right way, the best tax would be a regressive tax. So you're constantly incentivized to go out and earn that extra dollar. Just a thought. But no tax system is fair. It cannot be fair in all ways. It's just simply impossible. That's why the best system I think you can get is a flat tax that's very, very low. When the income tax was introduced, the lowest category was 0.5%. The highest category was 6%. On multimillionaires, 6%. Fine with me. 0.5% of my income, you got it. 38%, no, I don't think we should go there. All right. In rearing up the system is not pretended, nor is now that there is in the Constitution any positive grant of power to protect manufacturers. That's not technically what the bill said. You ought to know. You wrote it, Johnny. What it was doing was taxing foreign imports. Now, it may have the effect of protecting manufacturers, but that wasn't what the bill was. You got to separate intent and effect. Nor can it be denied that frequent attempts were made in the Constitution to obtain the power, and that they all failed, and that yet without any grant, notwithstanding failure to obtain one, it has become one of the leading powers of the government, influencing more extensively its movements and affecting more deeply and permanently the relative interests and conditions of the states and the probable fate of government itself than of all the enumerated powers united. What he's saying there is somewhat true. He says that basically you wrote the Constitution, but the impact of how you wrote it turned out that the legislature had the authority to levy import taxes, and that hurts the South. That's all true, but it's not unconstitutional. If you don't like it, change the Constitution. Say that the legislature may pass any import duties except those that have a disproportionate impact on one section. Then you're not going to get anything passed because everything is, what did I just say? Unfair. Influencing more extensively its movements and affecting more deeply and permanently the relative interests and conditions of the states and the probable fate of the government itself than of any of the enumerated powers united. From whatever source its advocates may derive the power, whether from the right to, quote, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises in the Constitution, or from that, quote, to regulate commerce, it plainly rests on the broad assumption that the power to impose duties may be applied not only to affect the original objects to raise revenue, but also to protect manufacturers, this not as incidental as a substantive independent power without reference to revenue or commerce, and this character has been used in building present system. What he's saying is true, but it's not unconstitutional. He's saying, well, when they started this and they gave Congress these powers, it could also cause these things to happen. Yeah, but that doesn't make it unconstitutional, and that doesn't give a state the right to interpose itself between the federal government and the people. You don't like it, change the Constitution. Pass a law regulating what can be included in a tariff. But you see, that's a problem, Johnny. You wrote the law. Can't ever get around that. That such a power resting on such a principle is unauthorized in the Constitution. It's fully authorized in the Constitution. He just said so. That it has become an instrument in the hands of the great dominant interests of the country to oppress the weaker, that is ultimately concentrate the whole power of the community in the general government and abolish the sovereignty of the states, and that discord, corruption, and eventually despotism must follow if the system is not resisted, we hold to be certain. Now, can we talk? Do you know which section of the country was the richest section of the country all the way up to 1860? That would not be the North. That would be the South. And do you know why it was the richest section of the country? Because of land and slaves. Slaves had value. You could sell them. You could take out a loan on your slaves. Land had value. Did you know that by 1860, there was more value in land and slaves in the South than in all, repeat after me, all railroads and textile mills in the North combined? Did you know that by 1860, of the 11 top wealthy states, 10 were in the South, all due to land and slaves? So for Calhoun to be making this argument like the North is all rich, he's ignoring the reality that, in fact, the South is richer than the North precisely because of slavery. Let's see. That it must ultimately concentrate the whole power of the community in the general government and abolish the sovereignty of the states. I'm on page 123. And that discord, corruption, and eventually despotism must follow the system is not resisted, we hold to be certain. Already we see the commencement of this disastrous train of consequences, the oppression of the weaker, the assumption by government. Hold on, John. Hold on. Whoa, time out. The oppression of the weaker, in the context of slavery. He's complaining about the tariff because the poor, weak Southerners, in the context of slavery, when many of the poor, weak Southerners owned slaves who were helpless. Just pointing out a few inconsistencies here. Okay. We already see the commencement of this disastrous train of consequences, the oppression of the weaker, the assumption by government of the right to determine finally and conclusively the extent of its own powers, and the denial and denunciation of the right of the states to judge of their reserved powers and defend them against the encroachments of the government, followed by discord, corruption, and the steady advance of despotic power. Now, he has something here. He is absolutely right that if unchecked, the tendency of government is to define its own powers as anything we want to do. And only recently, very recently, has this been checked by the Supreme Court in several decisions. West Virginia versus the EPA is one of them. Fifth Circuit's Jackison versus SEC is another one. There's several of these cases. The OSHA case involving the China virus vaccine. All of these have seen the Supreme Court or appellate courts of the United States of America rein in this tendency of the U.S. government to define its own powers. And courts have said, no, you agencies do not have this power unless the federal government, in framing your agency, gave you that power. Now, we saw this already in Marshall's decision involving the Charles River Bridge case, where Charles River Bridge said, we have a monopoly because we have a charter. And Marshall said, no, you do have a charter, but that charter did not expressly give you a monopoly. You only have a monopoly if the charter says you got a monopoly. And so Calhoun is right that it is the tendency of governments to define their power upward, but the states are not the breaking institution on that. The court is, and the president. Okay, but right now we have an eggplant, a rutabaga, as president, and so that he's not going to help. He's part of the problem, not part of the solution. And so as a result, the courts have stepped in and say, no, you don't have those authorities. You don't have that power. That something is wrong, I'll admit. And the assumption by government of power so extensive and dangerous is the true cause of the existing disorder and the only adequate one that can be assigned. We cannot entertain a doubt. Well, no, most people did not admit that. The North didn't admit it at all, and they were the more populous region of the country. To this unequal and excessive fiscal action of the government, which you wrote, John, may be immediately and clearly traced the growing discontent and alienation on the part of the oppressed portion of the community in greedy pursuit of office. John, whose party started that greedy pursuit of office? You remember my lessons on spoil system? that would be Democrats, John? Are you a Republican? No, you're a Democrat. Okay. The increasing spirit of servility, subserviency, and the corruption on the other, which all must see and acknowledge, which every lover of this country and its institutions must deplore, nor is it less clear that this dangerous assumption by which the reserve powers of states have been transferred to the general government is rapidly concentrating by a necessary operation the whole power of the government in the hands of the executive. I agree. We've transferred way too much power into the hands of the executive. That is both the legislature's fault in our own time. One of the reasons for this is that for almost 20 years, we have had a Congress, a House and a Senate, that absolutely refused to do the hard work of doing a budget. Because if you do a budget, somebody's going to get hurt. Because of necessity, we have a supposedly limited amount of money and an unlimited amount of demands for that money. So whenever you do a budget, you're saying, honey, we can't afford more bleach this trip to Walmart. If we're going to get enough food to make it to next time, we'll have to put the bleach off to next time and hope that we have enough left over next time to get food as well. Or we can't afford to replace the tires on your car right now. We just don't have the money. That's what's called a budget. It's making do. It's the basis of all economics. Making do with scarce resources. All resources are scarce. Everybody can't have everything they want. So how do you align resources? How do you divide resources in the general community among people? And you know, that's the question of our age, right? But it is true that over time, the legislatures have not done their jobs of passing budgets. They do these things called continuing resolutions, which are ridiculous. And this is specifically because they are cowards. Yes, Republicans and Democrats alike. There's only a handful of people up there who aren't total cowards. They're afraid to do a budget because of the fallout at home when special programs are cut, whether it's more defense spending, more aid to Ukraine, more aid to Africa, more cultural spending on various sexual orientation programs, whatever it is. Somebody's going to lose out. When they lose out, they're going to create a stink. When they create a stink, you might lose your job as a congressman. So let's just do a continuing resolution. We don't have to vote on a budget. What happens then? The power of Congress vanishes. Because you see, Congress really only has two, maybe three or four main powers. But the biggest one is the power of the purse, money. They control all the money. They can write laws. But of course, the laws have to, A, be signed by the president unless Congress has a 2/3 majority, and B, pass muster by the Supreme Court and the court system under judicial review. So there's a check on the Congress passing laws, but they do have the power of the purse. They are out there to allocate money, to raise taxes and to allocate money. And they haven't been willing to do that for years. So what happens? Presidents from George W. Bush to Barack Obama have had to operate through executive orders. Now, what was interesting was that President Trump begged the Congress to take back their authority to do budgets and to allocate the wall, build the wall. And he said, but if you're not going to do it, if you won't do your constitutional duty, I will. I'll find the money someplace. And he did, built 2/3 of the wall. So this is a truism. If you aren't exercising your dutiful powers in whatever office you have in life, captain of the football team, captain of the girls' soccer team, whatever it is, if you're not doing it, somebody will step in and do it, because you see, nature abhors a vacuum. And recently there's been a vacuum, and the president has increased in power. The courts are taking some of that power back. The legislature, the Congress is declining in power. The states are declining in power because they haven't done their job. Arizona has not blocked off its border with Mexico. New Mexico hasn't blocked off its border with Mexico. If you don't do it, somebody will. And you won't like who always ends up doing it. Okay. We must be blind to the lessons of recent experience not to see that the more government interferes with the labor and wealth of a community, the more it exacts from one portion and bestows on another. True. Just in the same proportion, the power of the department which is vested with its patronage be increased. It ought not. That's true too. And you know, whenever you have a program that is administered by somebody, the more money you give that program, the more powerful that bureau becomes. Take away their money. It ought not then be subject to surprise that this vast increase of power and revenues of the federal government and its unequal fiscal action, both in the collection and distribution, the latter in the power of the executive, on whose will be the disposition of the patronage of the government, mainly depends, and on which in turn depends on the powerful, active, mercenary corps of expectants created by the morbid moneyed action of government, should be of late so greatly and dangerously increased. John, you're absolutely right. Welcome to the real world, my friend. Why did you support the Democrat Party? They created this monster. They set it up. Oh, wait, for what purpose, Johnny? To protect and preserve slavery. He's complaining about the fact that you have big government, you have big bureaucracies growing out of the control of the people and the states. Why? Because there are people being rewarded with jobs from the spoil system. And where did that come from, Johnny? That came from Martin Van Buren. And why did he do that? To protect and preserve the slavery that you so cherish, Johnny. It is indeed not difficult to see this present state of things, if continued, must end, and that speedily, in raising this department of the government into an irresponsible and despotic power with the capacity of perpetuating itself through its own influence, virtually appointing its successor, or by controlling the presidential election. Wait, what? Controlling the presidential election? Are you talking about fraud here, John Calhoun? Through the patronage of government, and finally, as the virtue of patriotism and the people decay. What are we seeing about various polls of people's patriotism these days? Has it not decayed? He's writing this, right, in 1832. He's talking about patriotism decaying. By the introduction and open establishment of the hereditary principle. In taking the stand which she has, the state is solely influenced by a conscientious sense of duty to her citizens and to the Constitution, without the slightest feeling of hostility toward the interests of any section of the country, or no, BS. He was totally and very hostile, opposed to the North, or the remotest view to revolution or wish to terminate her connection with the Union, to which she is now and has ever been devotedly attached. Her object is not to destroy, but to restore and preserve. And in asserting her right to defend her reserve powers, she disclaims all pretension to control or interfere with the action of government within its proper sphere, or to assume tariff is its proper sphere, or to assume that any powers she has delegated to the government or conceded to the Confederated States. She simply claims the right of exercising the powers which, in adopting the Constitution, she reserved to herself. No, you didn't reserve this to yourself. And among them, the most important, essential of all, the right to judge, in the last resort, of the extent of her reserved powers, a right never delegated, not surrendered. No, the Constitution basically said the Supreme Court has that right to determine what those rights are. Madison said so. He says, I don't like it, but you have to have a final arbiter, and in our case, it will be the Supreme Court. He said that. He didn't like it, but he said it. Let's see. Could be, while the state retains her sovereignty, that it has not been, we appeal with the Constitution itself, which contains not a single grant that, on a fair construction, can be held to comprehend the power. It absolutely can, the right to levy taxes. It is not the state that interposes to arrest an unconstitutional act, but the government that passed it. Why won't you arrest an unconstitutional act? Because it's not unconstitutional. The government has not the right to add a particle to its powers, or to assume on part the exercise of a power not granted is plainly to oppose the confederated authority of the states, which have the right of granting powers exclusively belongs, and in so doing, the union itself, which they represent. On the contrary, a state is a member of the body in which the authority of the union resides. In arresting an unconstitutional act of government, it's not unconstitutional. It's part of the legislature's constitutionally delegated powers. Within its limits, so far from opposing, in reality supports the union, then the only effectual mode of which it can be done in such cases. To divest the states of this right would be, in effect, to give the government that authority of the Constitution which belongs to them exclusively, and which can only be preserved to them by leaving to each state, as the Constitution has done, to watch over and defend its reserved powers. This is not a reserved power. No state has a reserved power to tax. That is outside of state taxes. No, let me put it this way. No state has a reserved power to levy a national tax or to refuse to collect a national tax. Does not exist. In performing which it acts at the same time as a faithful and vigilant sentinel over the Confederate powers of states. We hold that our country has arrived at the very point of difficulty and danger contemplated by the framers of the Constitution in providing for a general convention of the states of the Union. And that, of course, the question, which, by the way, they had the authority to call. Note that he didn't try to call a convention of the states. Why? He would fail. Question now remained to be tested is whether there is sufficient moral elevation, patriotism, intelligence in the country to adjust through the interposition of its highest tribunals, whose right none can question, the conflicts which now threaten the very existence of our institutions and liberty itself, and which, as experience has proved, there is no other body belonging to the system having sufficient weight of authority to terminate. Such at last is our conviction. We have acted accordingly. It now rests with the other states to determine whether a general convention shall be called or not. Nobody did so. Nobody wanted one. Nobody saw this as a problem. And on that determination hangs, we solemnly believe, the future. By the way, the Confederate States did not have enough states to call a convention of the states either. The future fate of the country, it should be in favor of a call. We may, with almost perfect certainty, entertain the prospect of a speedy and happy termination of our difficulties, followed by peace, prosperity, lengthened political existence. But if not, we shall, by rejecting the remedy provided by the wisdom of our ancestors, prove that we deserve the fate which, in that event, will in all probably await the country. Interestingly, he was talking about a civil war, which the party he belonged to would bring on, partly by the very structure of the party he belonged to, set up, and mostly by the very slave system that he supported and demanded not change, not be subject to any constitutional corrections, fixes, or emancipation. All right. Hope that's been illustrative for today. I will see you guys on Wednesday.